Well, congratulations. You have finally worked your way up to the organ system level. So at this level, this is where we'll stay for the rest of our tour through the human body in our anatomy and physiology core sequence. So at times, if we get to a particular system where it's a bit more complex, you may have more than one chapter per system, like cardiovascular systems. Sometimes they have a blood chapter and a heart chapter and a blood vessel chapter. But we're going to be focused on that system level, or at least organizing our progression, looking at the different 11 systems of the body. Even though we've gotten up to that level, don't forget, though, that at each step along the way, we're going to be looking at, okay, what does that system do? What's its role in terms of maintaining homeostasis? What levels is it monitoring? Are they modifying and things like that? And then we'll also be drilling down, right? What are the cells that make it up? How do those cells contribute to its overall function, etc.? So as we go through, we're starting with some of the easier systems, which is a nice thing. So the skin or the integumentary system, then its skeletal system, then its muscular system, then nervous system. So what we'll find is with integumentary system and skeletal system, it's kind of a lot of anatomy. What's this? What's that? What's that? What are these layers, etc.? And we do ascribe the function for it as well. Why do we have these layers of the epidermis? What are these cells for as opposed to these cells, etc.? But not a lot of processes where we're describing steps of this turns to that, this leads to that, etc. We may see that sometimes when we're talking about how bones grow, or like we saw in the end of the last lecture, how tissues repair. But these first couple of systems, it's not too bad in terms of the physiology. So it's something to think of, though, is we're, like we said, we've got to be prepared to always go down to the cellular level. And as we move forward, there'll be more and more in terms of how these particular cells do their functions, how muscle cells contract, how neurons send signals using changes in their membrane potential, how the heart contracts, how the blood moves through the systems, how in the immune system, how these different white blood cells protect us against these foreign agents. So when we get to 202, we do find that those systems are a little bit more complex, a little bit more physiology, but this is a nice kind of graduated stepwise system to get up to that level. So that being said, let's get into the skin. So skin or integumentary system, remember this is a body system. So by definition, a body system or an organ system has multiple organs inside of it. Those organs made up of different tissues, made up of cells, etc. So what are we thinking of in terms of organs making up this system? Right? So we have the skin, but we also have hair associated with it and nails. We have different types of sweat glands like we talked about before. We also have different types of oil glands or sebaceous glands too. So while it's not a very diverse system in terms of the items and organs that make it up, it still counts as an organ system. Okay, so when we look at the skin itself, what we're going to find is that it has two distinct regions or layers to it. So it's got the epidermis. So this is going to be our epithelial tissue, right? And we'll talk about what epithelial type, but think back to the different epithelial types. Is it going to be one that is going to be simple or stratified? Do we need it to be thin? Do we need it to be thick? You got to think about those types of things, and we will see, according to what we know before, what that actual epithelial type is going to be. But epidermis is epithelial tissue, and of course epithelial tissue is going to be avascular. Once we get down from the epidermis, superficial layer of the skin, then we're going to go down to the dermis, the deeper layer instead. And the dermis is mostly fibrous connective tissue, that dense irregular connective tissue, and well vascularized, right? That's where the blood vessels are coming in order to supply the nutrients, oxygen, etc. for the epidermis up above. Now, you also hear about a layer that's called the hypodermis, but notice I said the skin has two distinct regions or layers. The hypodermis is not a layer of the skin. Hypo means under. So this is a layer that's underneath the dermis, or it's also called the subcutaneous layer. Now we know that the skin is called the cutaneous membrane. So a subcutaneous layer is a layer deep to the skin, not part of the skin. So this is where we find our fat. right? Subcutaneous adipose tissue, which acts as a shock absorber, insulates, etc. Has its protective function as well as storing energy. It also helps to anchor the skin to the underlying structures, which for the most part are going to be the muscles. What kind of muscles? Not smooth, not cardiac, but skeletal muscles, right? Okay, we'll also find some muscles even inside of the skin itself. So we'll see those coming up. So here's our diagram of our skin. So we've got, again, two layers, epidermis and dermis. So here's our epidermis, and here is our dermis here, and then hypodermis down below. So you can see, right, epidermis is not very thick compared to all of this underneath, which is the dermis. Also, epidermis, which is more superficial, made up of only epithelial tissue, whereas we can see there's a whole lot going on down here, down in the dermis, right? Different types of glands. Here's that muscle I was referencing, right? This is called the erector pili muscle that is attached to the hair follicle, so it makes the hair stand up when you're cold, etc. So lots going on down in the dermis. But we're going to start at the epidermis and work our way down. So, epidermis is, as you might imagine, stratified squamous epithelium. Thick, with lots of layers so that we can be protected, right? So in the epidermis, they're keratinized as well. Remember we talked about different types of protein fibers, the cytoskeleton. So keratinized fibers are protein fibers that add strength to these cells that are found on the outside of our body, or the outer layer of our body that's supposed to protect us. Now, with the epidermis, there's 4 different cell types that we get inside of the epidermis. They're all different types of epithelium, but they have specific types, right? So we have keratinocytes that produce the keratin, and these are the major cells of the epidermis. So lots of keratinocytes making up the epidermis, so specialized epithelial cells connected by the desmosomes, and a lot of these slough off every day. So the outermost layers with the stratified squamous epithelium, the more superficial layers, are further away from the nutrients. They're also going through apoptosis and dying off. And so they're there just like you put clothes on to help protect you, right? Those extra layers give you protection. Protection from the sun, protection from abrasion, things like that. So millions of them slough off every day. In fact, most of the dust that you have around your house, dead skin cells. Okay. So keratinocytes. Then we have melanocytes. So melanocytes are in the deeper layers of the epidermis, and these produce, as the name indicates, melanin, which are packaged into these little packages called melanosomes. And the melanin that's produced, obviously, is one of the things that gives skin its color, whether it's an individual body spot, like a mole or something like that, or whether it's the overall color. So they help to protect us against UV damage. And the melanin that they make, they actually transfer to some of the surrounding keratinocytes. So we don't have just protection in one spot, we have protection overall. So melanocytes. Then we have dendritic cells. So dendritic cells, you know, this is our border, right, between inside and outside. And so at your border, you usually have guards, right? And so dendritic cells are our guards that are macrophages, right? Big eating cells that are on patrol in case something tries to come in. We can eat them up and then activate the immune system. And then finally, we have tactile or Merkel cells. We said that epithelial tissue is avascular, but we do have receptors up there which tell us what's going on near the surface of the body. So these are touch types of receptors. And in fact, there's different touch receptors, but it makes sense for these that are giving us kind of light touch, they need to be right near the surface so that we can tell. All right, so 4 different cell types in the epidermis. Then we get to the layers of the epidermis. So the epidermis itself, even though it's stratified squamous epithelium, there are 4 or 5 distinct strata or layers through it. So it depends on where you are in the body. Thick skin, like the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, have 5 layers to it. We need more protection there. Thin skin, which is basically everywhere else, is where we're going to have only 4 layers instead. So each of these strata, an individual one we call stratum, has a particular name. So if we start down at the bottom, stratum basale, then spinosum, then granulosum, then lucidum, and corneum. And in fact, when we look at it, right, so this is going to be the deepest layer here, superficial down at the bottom. And notice that this one here is going to be the one that is only found in thick skin. So stratum lucidum is only found in thick skin. So sometimes when we're trying to learn all these things, sometimes if we use little memory tricks, it can help us to learn names or how to pronounce them or whatever. Now, oftentimes we talk about the different layers of the epidermis. We need to know them in order, whether deep to superficial or superficial to deep. And if we look at the first letter of all 4 of these layers, we can make up a silly little mnemonic, not pneumatic, we'll talk about that some other time, mnemonic or kind of name that will help us to remember them. So like if we look at those and we say C, L, G, S, B, you might come up with something like Charlie likes green super balls. Charlie likes green super balls. Now, totally silly. You're like, that's really dumb. But if you can just remember that phrase, it will give you the first letter of all 5 layers found in thick skin from superficial, C, to deep, B. So, definitely, if you come up with something different that is pretty good, send it to me. Post it on the discussion board or something like that. Maybe I'll use yours instead of my silly one. Okay, so let's talk about these layers. So, stratum basale, this is the deepest layer, right? Like the basement, etc. So this one is going to be closest to the dermis, closest to the nutrients, etc. And it's a single layer of cells. They're more like cuboidal in shape, and this is where actual mitotic divisions are occurring. So these cells are very actively dividing almost all the time, because remember, at the very surface we're constantly losing cells, whether they're being scraped off or just kind of rubbed off or falling off or whatever, and we have to replace them. So down here, this is where we're replacing them. It's kind of like popcorn you see at the movie theater. It's kind of popping up and up and up and up and up. So down here at the stratum basale, this is where those mitotic divisions are occurring. So it usually takes about a month or so from a cell to be created down in the stratum basale and then migrate through all these layers and then be sloughed off. Now there's always going to be a few layers, a few cells that stay down there in the stratum basale as kind of the feeder cells, right? If they all divided and then went up, we'd have nothing left at the bottom. So there's always some that are stayed down at the bottom there. So the stratum basale is the single layer of cells where all the division is occurring. It's also sometimes called the stratum germinatum. You're talking about like seeds germinating and growing, etc. That's kind of where the name comes from. We usually use stratum germinatum if we're talking about like the stratum basale, like underneath the fingernails and places like that. But for the most part, that deepest layer of the epidermis that we find everywhere else, we just call them stratum basale. Okay, so we found actively dividing cells down there. We also find melanocytes down there as well. All right, so we go up from the basale to the spinosum. So the spinosum, right, the spiny cells, this is several layers thick, and these ones kind of look spiky. What happens is they have attachments to them so that they can be pulled on and give us some of the protection, etc. But what happens is the keratinocytes in here, when you're in the microscope and the cells they have the cell connections, right? Like the desmosomes that are connecting to each other. But when the cells kind of shrink, those connections are still held in place and the rest of the cell kind of shrinks in. It gives them this spiky appearance where they're only stretched out where the desmosomes are. So they kind of look spiky, like we said, prickly or whatever. And so that's where the name comes from, spinosum. It looks like they have spines. So what we find is, in this layer, in the spinosum, we find keratinocytes, also melanosomes as well. So melanosomes and some dendritic cells. Okay, granulosum. So the granular layer, as you would imagine from the name, is also a few cell layers thick, but what happens here is we start to see granules inside of the cells, giving it its name. So the cells are starting to get flattened because they're getting further, right? Basale and then spinosum. Now we're getting even further away from where the nutrients are. And the keratinization basically begins where we really start filling him in with those keratin filaments for protection. They also accumulate these, so we have the keratin hyaline granules in it, but they also start to get some of our granules of melanin as well. So in any case, with the granules like that, granules that are the keratohyalin, granules that have glycolipids in them, so that our skin can help us to regulate fluids. You hear about people that have burns, that have lost skin or something like that, motorcycle accident. Not only are they prone to infection because they don't have this physical barrier, but also they are very prone to becoming dehydrated and not being able to regulate their fluids because it just basically evaporates straight off the lower layers. So the granules that are found in the granulosome layer help to kind of waterproof the skin too. Okay, so granulosome is our border between living and dead. These are kind of like the zombie cells, if you will. Then we get to the lucidum. Now remember, the lucidum is only found in thick skin. And this is only 2 to 3 cell layers thick, but it tends to be clear. It's kind of a whitish layer when you're seeing it in the microscope. And this one, like we said, is an additional layer of keratinocytes, which gives us more protection, like in the palms of the hand. So we only really need it there. So we go lucidum, then the last one, corneum. So corneum is the thickest layer, and this one is just anucleated, very, very flat, keratinized dead cells. And so it is, again, physically protecting us against abrasion and water loss, etc. So it's okay that those are dead cells, just like having on a, some sort of denim jacket or something like that for protection. Those dead layers of cells out in the corneum also give us protection. And like we mentioned as well, when we go from deep to superficial, these cells tend to die off through apoptosis, as well as dying off just because they're away from those nutrients. And in fact, we shed, in terms of skin cells, about 50,000 cells every minute. So, again, contributes to that dust. So when you dust and it goes into the air and you breathe it back in, hey, you're like recycling right there. All right, so here we can see those layers of the epidermis, right? So here's the corneum, the thickest layer. When we look for the lucidum, it should be just right here. So it'd be a lighter layer right through here. Granulosum, we can see those granules through there, right? Inside of those cells, you can see those granules, those little dots. Then the spinosum, they don't always look spiky, but these cell layers here are the spinosum. And remember, just this single layer of cells right at the very bottom is going to be the basale. Okay? All right. So that is the epidermis, superficial layer of the skin. Then we go down to dermis. Now, remember, epidermis, even though it's all stratified squamous epithelium, we found that there are 4 different cell types. We found there are 4 or 5 different layers of cells in there as well. So, make sure that you learn that. Now, dermis. Dermis is the deeper layer, the thicker layer. It's a lot of flexible connective tissue, lots of different organs and cells in there as well. Fibroblasts, they secrete more fibers, macrophages on patrol, mast cells as part of our immune system as well, and even some white blood cells there. When we look at the fibers, right, the fibers themselves are helping to bind the upper layers as well as to the lower layers. And when you talk about leather and you look at the underside, you're talking about the hide, that white, that's actually where we're talking about the connective tissue matrix of the dermis. Anyway, lots of different organs going through there, blood vessels, nerves, lymphatic vessels, picking up extra fluid, etc. And lots of different glands too, right? Oil glands, sweat glands, and the hairs that we see projecting from the surface, they go down through the epidermis and are anchored and actually grow from layers down in the dermis itself. Now the dermis actually has 2 layers of its own. First layer is called the papillary layer. Second layer is going to be called the reticular layer. So here's a shot. Again, epidermis up towards the top. Now this one is for the skin. All of this out here, that's stratum corneum right there. See how thick the stratum corneum is? You can't even really tell the cells. This is part of a sweat gland duct that's coiling around and reaching up towards the surface here where the sweat's going to be released. And then here, right, we can see some of our other layers. So granulosum, spinosum, and then basale right along the bottom here. But starting here, when we go down, this is going to be dermis. Papillary layer is like the top 20%, and then the reticular layer is more like the bottom 80% instead. So the papillary layer is a superficial layer of areolar connective tissue, which is kind of interdigitating, if you will, with the lowest layers of the epidermis. So it helps to hold the epidermis on. It also forms these kind of interlocking dermal papillae that keep the epidermis from sliding off. If it was just smooth like this, the epidermis could move around a bit. But if we lock it up like this, with the dermal papillae extending up into it, it helps to hold it in place. Now, also in these dermal papillae, like we see, so you can see them right there. So the dermal papillae, that's a dermal papilla, that's a dermal papilla, that's a dermal papilla, that's a dermal papilla. Now you get the idea why they call it the papillary layer. But you can see it's the most superficial layer of the dermis. So if we have blood vessels, or if we want receptors as close as possible to the surface to help out with the epidermis and the outside, we're going to have them extend right up here as well. So we do find those up there, capillary loops, nerve endings, and even touch receptors, different types of touch receptors that are called Meissner corpuscles for very light touch. Now, in some places, like in thick skin, sole of your foot, palm of the hand, the dermal papillae not only have small ridges that interlock, but they're so big they actually form the ridges, the friction ridges that we call the fingerprints, the toe prints, and the ridges that we have on the palms of the hand and the soles of the feet. So you can see them right here. So there is a dermal papilla that is underlying each of these different layers that are sticking up like that. And you can actually see the openings for the sweat glands coming up through there as well. Okay, so papillary layer, about the top 20%. Reticular layer is the bottom 80% instead, right? This is where we have that dense fibrous, dense irregular connective tissue. It looks like it's all kind of mixed up. A lot of collagen fibers there, and lots of blood vessels and nervous pathways that are going through there as well. Sometimes little pockets of adipose tissue. Sometimes the transition between the dermis, lower dermis, and the hypodermis isn't quite so clear, because hypodermis is all adipose tissue, and the dermis itself has pockets of adipose tissue, so it's hard to see a solid line. Now, related to the skin, and related to the dermis, and related to tissue repair, comes some topics like stretch marks. So the striae are stretch marks. So if there has been an active period of growth, so sometimes it has to do with gaining fat, you can get stretch marks. Again, the skin and the underlying tissues grow so much, it stretches the skin so much, it can't, through mitotic division, fill in fast enough. So it may layer in fibers in there instead, kind of like a regular scar. So you do see that. So those are connective tissue scars that are through the dermis and through the hypodermis. We can see them there. And you also can get blisters. So blisters are not connective tissue, but it's where there's been some abrasion, right? We have all these protective layers, but if you have like a shoe that doesn't fit right and that one spot is getting rubbed and rubbed and rubbed, well, your body is responding to changes in the external environment and says, hey, you know what? That epidermis there, even though it's 5 layers thick, it's maybe not even doing the job. I'm worried we're losing skin cells. We're going to wear it down too quickly. We need to quickly put in some extra protection there. So a blister is some fluid that actually creates pockets there in between the epidermis and the dermis as a balloon to help cushion, kind of like an airbag, but a fluid bag to help cushion against that extra abrasion that's going on. Other things associated with the skin, tattoos, right? So with tattoos, there are, some cases of good tattoos, some cases of bad tattoos. You don't ever want, it's like a Snickers commercial there when you see actual, misspellings and stuff like that. Life goes on. Winner. Anyway, tattoos. So how do tattoos work, right? It's not just a Sharpie where you're coloring the surface, right? As you do that, when the epidermis is shed and those layers, superficial layers are shed, it comes off, right? But tattoos where you're injecting ink down into the dermis itself. We know that the dermis doesn't grow and slough off, and so it has to go down. The needle has to go down into the dermis itself. That's why it's very important that it's sterile, etc. You're getting down to blood vessels and things like that, so you want to make sure you're not introducing things like bacteria into there. So don't go doing it yourself. Okay, other things about the skin. Skin color. So the color from the skin, we already talked about one place where skin color comes from, and that is melanin, right? Melanocytes produce melanin. They help to absorb UV light from the sun, etc. And there's actually two different types of melanin. There's the brownish black, as well as kind of a lighter reddish yellow. And the interesting thing is when we talk about melanin, melanocytes and keratinocytes and stuff like that, the number of cells that have the melanin and that produce the melanin are actually the same between different people of different colored skin. But what happens is the differences are in whether they produce the darker melanin or the lighter one, and how many of these melanin granules are produced and transferred to other skin cells. So, I mean, if you talk about, little spots, oh, I'm very, very dark, right? But that's only an active little area of the darker melanin types. It's not all over my body. So, not the number of cells that produce melanin, but how much they produce and what form. All right, so melanin contributes to skin color. Keratin also comes and contributes to skin color. So if we look at that, that looks like carrot. This is a pigment that basically comes from orange and red, different types of vegetables and things like that. So that's how we get it in our diet. And then it can accumulate in the skin, again, to help give color, etc. But not only can the skin use it, but it also, keratin can be converted into retinine, which is vitamin A, which is used for, right, vision. So for the photoreceptors in the eye. But with keratin, like we said, it's dietary. You get it, and it then accumulates in the skin. But there is too much of a good thing as well. So sometimes you see people that are on the health kick and they're drinking lots of carrot juice or something like that. When I worked at a grocery store, when I was going through school, I worked at a grocery store as a laser technician, right? Beep, beep. Anyway, there was a guy that would come in and he would get carrot juice all the time, and you would look at the palms of his hands and the pallor, the color of his skin, and he was orange. It also happens with babies quite often because when they start eating the baby food, right, any of those mixed foods, mixed vegetables and the meal types of foods and stuff like that, the predominant vegetable in there is carrot. And so, inadvertently, people will give their kids a ton of carrots, and through time, they'll start to turn more and more orange. And because it's kind of a gradual thing, they don't actually notice it, and then like they'll take their baby in for a doctor's appointment, and the doctor's like, hey, you need to kick back a little bit on those carrots and different types of foods that contain carrots. Go for the green beans and stuff like that for a while. It's kind of funny. Okay, melanin, keratin, and hemoglobin. Now hemoglobin, that's a little bit interesting, right? So hemoglobin is really associated with the blood, but we know that the dermis has lots of blood vessels, and hemoglobin, particularly when it's binding oxygen, that's its main role inside of red blood cells, it causes the skin to have that kind of reddish color or ruddy color. And the more blood is going to the skin, the redder it looks. So if you're exercising in the gym or something like that, we're generating a lot of heat, and we want to get rid of that heat, so we run the hot blood right near the surface of the skin, and that heat will radiate off of us. But that makes us look flushed, right? So you can see that one of the things that the skin contributes to in terms of homeostasis is temperature, right? So if we're cold, we constrict those blood vessels and we keep it in towards the core. If we're warm, we're going to route the blood right to the surface of the skin. We might even start sweating, etc. So anyway, hemoglobin also will contribute to skin color. In areas of thinner skin or thicker skin, it may look lighter or darker, right? That's where lipstick came from and rouge came from originally. They were the symbols of health, right? So if you had a ruddy complexion, then you were very healthy as opposed to pale, etc. So if you add that in, then evolutionarily, you look like you're healthier. Now, the trend of black lipstick and stuff like that, I don't know how that would be, necessarily what that's going to be showing, but, it's a trend. Okay. So, At this point, what we've done is we've talked about the major layers of the skin, epidermis and dermis. We've talked about the layers and cells that contribute to those. And now, for the rest of the time, what we're going to switch to is talking about those different kind of accessory structures or accessory organs that we find inside of the skin. Talking about the erector pili muscles and the hair and the different types of sweat glands and different types of receptors and nervous system structures, etc. So we'll see that as we continue on to Part 2, talking about the integumentary system.